global audience, and some methods and tools that are at your disposal to make your English content translate well in other languages and kind of go more smoothly to the web using multi-channel distribution. So I'm going to cover a few things. I'll cover global English standardization, or how to write content that's easily and cleanly translated to another language. Then I'll address some standard design best practices for global content. And then from there, Nathan is going to demonstrate the API that KJI and Ingeniux built together to pull content for translation from Ingeniux's CMS to KJI link, and then, you know, a few other best practices like how to translate and optimize your content in the CMS, and structuring your content for multi-channel reuse. Okay, so the first thing I want to go over is just global English, or how to write content for a global audience when you're using source English copy as a native speaker, and how it came to be, and how you can make global English for your company. So I'm going to first talk about how global English, that whole term, how it kind of came to be. It's actually not. It's not a spoken language. It's primarily written. It's most easily explained as the type of English that most often is taught internationally, so for ESL students, for example. In the 1930s, this English gentleman named Charles Ogden developed something called Basic English, and I put a Wikipedia link up there for you to look up Basic English, and you can learn about Charles Ogden's principles if you like. So sorry, I'll go back a little bit. What he did was he laid out a bunch of principles for simplified basic English, which became the basis for the more standardized global English writing form that we, as a translation agency, will sort of tell you to stick to when you're writing standard English. But surprisingly, there's not really a governing body that watches over this and sets standards. It's really just been this guy in the 30s that he's about as close as we got. But in other languages, there are institutes and governing bodies that rule kind of how you use grammar and structure. One example would be the Real Academia Española, and I'm butchering that in Spanish. I apologize to all my Spanish teachers. But anyway, it's the RAE, and you can also look that up if you'd like, but we don't have that for English, so it's kind of not well known. So you can think of global English as a conglomerate of a few different spoken and written types of the language. Anglophone countries, mainly the US and England, have the heaviest influence on global English development to date. So, and you know, to that end, English is naturally a lot more structured and standard when it's written rather than when it's spoken. So variations in terms of your word choice, your tone, your dialect, and et cetera, they all increase when you speak. So when you're creating global communications, whether they're written or spoken, it's best to write and speak the same way you would when writing a formal communication. And the reason for that is if it's being translated or interpreted by an interpreter, it's just far more easy for the interpreter to translate. And as somebody who knows English as a second language, they typically learn it in a very formal fashion from teachers. They don't use slang or language shortcuts. Formal tends to translate a lot more easily, and that's kind of why we recommend that you do that. So to help us further wrap our minds around global English, I just want to set up a comparison for you. We're going to take a look at the difference between American English and global English. So American English is only spoken in the US. All other English-speaking locales will use a variation on it, which is their dialect. So when you're creating content as a US citizen that you're going to send for translation, or you're launching it in another English-speaking country, it's important to realize that there may be some idiosyncrasies in your language that might not translate well. American English has colloquialisms, or ways we use language shortcuts in American English to kind of, you know, either make our readers laugh or help them understand something faster, but they're unique to us in the U.S. And I guess the easiest way to kind of talk about this is the phrase rule of thumb. So as a Native American English speaker, well, as a United States-based English speaker, I know that means a general rule or a guideline, but it might translate or be interpreted kind of wrong, potentially. So what if it ended up reading a guideline of hand instead of a rule of thumb? Now you've really lost everybody, and it has no meaning at all. So it's kind of similar with pop culture references. One that comes to mind is the way popular culture uses the word literally. So like, I have literally no idea what you're talking about. This exact phrase I can understand and you can understand, and literally has been kind of overused in our language right now. And that extra word is really confusing when it's translated, and it can kind of throw off the meaning. References to sports work this way too. The phrase "the whole 9 yards" is an example. It doesn't make any sense if you don't get the sports reference. So just be aware that not everybody uses language the way that you do, and that's what makes it very difficult to translate. It's important to mention, though, that this isn't just limited to American English. The same can be said for UK English, Canadian English, Australian, Kiwi. Everyone has a little twist on it about the way they write and talk that's very locale-based. It's why we at KJI really stress to our clients that formal standardized writing is going to translate best with least confusion for your target readers. So just kind of remember that it's not just us here in the U.S., but anybody that's based in another location is going to have idiosyncrasies that just aren't going to go well. So if you weren't already convinced that standardized, more formal global English is the way to go, I'm here to highlight a few things that can help tip the scales for you. So when you write in a consistent, standard, and formal fashion, one of the benefits is that the reader will take less time to comprehend your messages. This is definitely a plus for things like instruction manuals or instruction sheets, IFUs, any of that, but it can also be beneficial for marketing. So if you're creating content that has a lot of sort of really regional reference, it's going to be tough to translate that to a global market. Standardized writing can also help improve the accuracy of the text. And why? Well, because you're likely using fewer words, so you're getting a little bit more to the point, and you have shorter sentences. And the words that you choose will help have a more accurate message, because, again, you're just a little bit more efficient with what you're putting on the page. Standardized writing increases the consistency of your translations. That makes sense just because when you write everything in a standardized way and send it to a translator, the translations are going to come back very similar time after time, especially if you're using a consistent translator for your company. So again, you just don't have as much room for error. And then finally, standardized writing is going to lower translation costs overall. When you send text out for translation to KJI, for example, we utilize something called a CAT tool, and a CAT tool analyzes the text that you submit to find repeated phrases and texts, and then it organizes it so that the translator can move quickly through the process. So obviously, if your text is standardized and consistent, the tool can do more because it's going to find more consistent phrases that you're using. And the translator can move faster, which will lower your costs and help keep you right on time for planning purposes. But full disclosure, there are some challenges that you'll face when you create standardized English, and let's go over those. So Standardization is inherently beneficial when you create global English communications, but the limitations are kind of obvious. The first that I'm kind of pointing out here is that it can limit your message because it naturally is going to limit creativity and word choice and tone options, and you'll have fewer, like a more restricted vocabulary. Standardizing a message can also be difficult, at least initially, when multiple writers are involved. Communication design is very highly subjective, and what I mean by this is that the same message or idea will almost always be articulated differently from individual to individual. So that kind of brings you back to the importance of standardization, but it also highlights the challenge of creating messaging standards when there are multiple business units or divisions involved. So that's something to think about. The final challenge I want to touch on is understanding when the standards should be used. It's really important that all standards are implemented from the top down and that all employees have the resources available to them should they have questions about how to apply standardized English and when. So that can be a challenge because you've got to kind of build a framework around how you use this language, almost like you would if you were creating a style guide for you know, your company logo and colors and fonts. You're kind of almost creating one for how you're using language now too. Okay, so let's talk about the nuts and bolts of creating standardized global English for businesses. So here are a few guidelines that can kind of help get you started. The first is limit the length of your sentences. This is going to help you create direct messaging that isn't full of confusing terms. And another tip you can use is to remember to avoid multiple forms of punctuation in text. Typically, if you have a longer sentence, you're going to have a couple forms of punctuation. And maybe a comma or two isn't so bad, but if you have commas and colons and semicolons, it can get kind of tricky in a hurry. And again, that's just for translation and localization purposes. There's just a lot of ways it could be interpreted the longer your sentence gets. So you kind of want to take a page out of Hemingway's book here and keep it clean and short. Generally, we don't want you to be, at KJI, we sort of recommend that you don't go longer than 15 to 20 words in any given sentence. The next thing I want to talk about is using the active voice. So whenever you can, try to structure your sentences actively. So Andrea presents a webinar, this is a sentence example. The opposite of that would be the passive, which would be the webinar is presented by Andrea. And passive voice kind of increases the ambiguity, and it can confuse who or what the primary subject is within the sentence. So kind of almost grammar school level breakdowns here. The active voice tends to translate very well across virtually every language, but the passive really gets murky in a hurry. And then you want to limit US-centric writing and style, which we kind of talked about with American English as I broke that down for you a little bit, but remember, we just want you to keep it formal, especially in a written communication. Avoid being too casual or friendly. Not that you shouldn't be friendly if you're trying to attract readers, or you should, you know, continue to develop content that's compelling. But generally, it's best to be formal when you know it needs to be translated. And for an example, let's say you were creating like an e-learning module on your website. I might avoid using like the phrase, good job, with an exclamation point when you can. It just sounds a little too informal in an official communication. And in some cultures, training is way more formal than it is here. But either way, there's a risk of confusing or alienating the reader or the user, and it might be appropriate in certain cases, but generally speaking, to be safe, it can be a little bit easier on you from a translation perspective if you keep it not so casual. Marketing materials, as I sort of said, have a lot more flexibility, but it might take a few rounds of edits to get your messaging just right in your target language, which might take a very specialized look from a translator. So, and kind of in that same vein, humor and sarcasm are really hard to translate. Sarcasm isn't picked up by the intended target all the time, and it can result in your target audience being offended or confused. Certain cultures dislike sarcasm altogether, so if you can, just kind of avoid it entirely. When in doubt, allow anybody who is translating your material to have edit control. And again, I can't really speak for other companies, but at KJI, our translators are familiar with regional customs, and they'll generally know if a certain message will resonate with the audience, and you can really use them as a resource to make sure you're not being kind of too U.S. focused. Okay, and then beyond creating standardized global English, here are a few best practices for translation that you can consider when you are creating English source text that you might want to be translated and localized into another language. And again, I kind of have touched on this throughout, but it really does need to be, your standardized English guidelines need to come from the top down. Ideally, for a company launching messaging in global markets, there's corporate support on all levels. Everyone's writing this way, from interns to C-level executives. If you're using corporation-specific terms and acronyms, include some context when you send them off to be translated. So, for example, if your company has created a product with a specific name, you may always want it to be translated that way, or you may not want it to be translated out of English at all. Either way, it's fine, but it just has to be consistently laid out for your language service provider and for your translators. The same is true of acronyms. Even common terms we say all the time, like EOD or EOB and ROI, those may need to be written out in their entirety, at least in the first use, or just not used at all. And then kind of building off that, if your company is planning on operating globally, I really highly recommend building a glossary. Many of you who work with us at KJI know all about glossaries from a translation perspective and how they're managed. But for those that don't, a glossary is a set of terms that they're company-specific or industry-specific, and you can say whether or not you would like them to be translated or how they should be translated, regardless of language or target region. And glossaries, again, because it's sort of a little more set in stone, they help promote consistent terminology use, and they're really a crucial part of well-structured global messaging. All right, so beyond the meanings and the use of the words, when you're writing for a global audience, there are some language design principles and hurdles that you need to understand before you kind of get knee deep in it. So text expansion is the first thing I'm going to touch on. When you translate from English into most target languages, expect your text to expand about 20% from the original. More words and characters may need to be added to say the same thing in Romance languages in particular, like French and Spanish. But you know, that's not always true. Actually, sometimes your text will shrink in particular, like Asian languages, because of the economy of size of the characters. Sometimes the text can shrink up to 10 to 15%. So, however you've laid it out, the actual communication, expect for it to change a little bit when you send it out for translation. It may not affect your website as much if you've created a program with a little more responsive design, but it could really affect any printed materials that you're creating, or like a PDF, things like that. So I'm going to kind of focus on the web because I believe that's what a lot of you are using, but know that that also will affect your printed materials as well. And then, so again, because I'm focusing on the web for you, so for translated websites, titles and subtitles are almost always going to change in length. So you might have bleed over into a second line with that awesome title you wrote when it's translated into Spanish. And that might be fine, or it might look kind of funny. But this is why validation and testing could be a good step to incorporate, so you can edit your page before you launch it in a different language. Similarly, infographics or graphics you're using with text might have issues after text expansion. And then finally, when you're formatting for different platforms, namely for mobile or tablets, it's important to remember that your translated text is going to look different. It already does look different when you take it from a PC-based to mobile, but just make sure you kind of test it on all devices that you could potentially have your site be seen on. And then I'll just kind of go over in detail some places for you to particularly pay attention to when you're localizing content after translation. Okay, so when you're writing text that's going to be translated into certain languages, I'm going to back out a little bit. There are only so many stylistic choices available to you. In particular, Turkish, Greek, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Thai, and Hindi are all examples of kind of style trouble languages because they use characters that deviate from a standard English alphabet. And that's going to affect, in particular, things like emboldening and italicizing your text. So I'm going to show you a little example here where you can kind of see there we have emboldened text followed by not emboldened text, and really once you translate that, we couldn't do that in this Asian font. So that's something to remember. And then again, so here's an example here of when you want to kind of combine. So say you really like the bold is really important to you, you could potentially combine styles and fonts to get the job done if that's really important to you. So it's just, again, you may want to consider combining them for the design and style of your page, but you know, that's totally a corporate decision. It's acceptable. And then just the last thing for today that I'm going to cover with you is a few examples of how you can avoid bad design when you're translating in graphics and infographics. You're translating them in your page. So the first guideline is slightly more white space than you otherwise would potentially in the design of your images and graphics. Again, this will help with Romance languages where the text is going to get bigger. I'm going to zoom into that example so you can see exactly what I mean, but we'll just kind of do a 30,000-foot view for now. And then give extra room in callouts and labels. In a design element where translated text needs to be centered or otherwise applied, this is an important consideration. Give extra room in tables. Even though numbers don't tend to expand, your table headers will, which might kind of look bad if you don't plan ahead and you're not kind of ready to have to change that. So here is your include white space detail, and I've done a little kind of crude highlighting, my apologies. We're looking at some instructions that a company has sent to us for translation. You can see on the left-hand side of the page, it's in English, and on the right-hand side of the page, it's in French. You can see that they've used some standard symbols on the page for safety, and I'm not entirely sure what that second one is, but the blurred out text on the English side is a single line, and the blurred out text on the French side is actually bled over into a second line. Thankfully, when they created this in English, they left ample room for things to expand, but you can see too in the list, and actually overall in the text, it really had to shift quite a bit from one language to the other. So again, just something to think about when you're creating a graphic, especially kind of an infographic or anything that's supposed to be on your page that might incorporate text and images. Similar here. So here's the close-up of my extra room in callouts and labels. You can see the text expanded from English so much that the poor DTP engineers really just couldn't get it much smaller to fit in that circle. So, you know, they've kind of done a mixed bag of things on this page, and it probably would have been better if they could have figured out how to remove the words from the design element altogether. But just so you guys know that this is kind of a risk you can face when you're translating. And then here's my last example. This is where it's important to give extra room in tables for translated headers. You can see that in some cases it went on to 3 lines, but it, it was supposed to go into 2. And, they expanded the table, and it's totally acceptable in written language to have a hyphen after a shortened word, but it may not look as slick as you would want it to, so, that's just something to keep in mind. All right, so now that you've learned a little bit about how to create Global English and design it well, I'll just turn it over to Nathan, and he can explain to you a little bit about what KJI and Ingeniux have done to make translating from your CMS easier and to distribute your translated content to multiple channels.
I want to say thank you to Andrea for that nice presentation. We're going to transition now into looking at how that translation process can occur with Ingeniux CMS. We're looking at a sample website here that's got a couple different language translations. We support translation with our product in a couple different ways. Some of them are a little bit different or unique compared to other CMSs you may have worked with before. Like a lot of products, we do support mirroring of content where a source language such as English can have an identical mirror in one or more other languages, and the changes and all can be propagated from the English updates to the equivalent languages that you've translated it to. Today with our demonstration, we're going to show the Ingeniux Translation Manager workbench, and that's going to allow us to send content to KJI for translation into a specific language. So we'll come back here in just a moment. I'm just going to explain a little bit more about the structuring and management of multilingual content briefly. So in here we have some example content that's been translated already to German. So we have the English version of the publication area of this sample website, and then we have already translated part of that site into German here, where you can see the individual documents have been updated, things like the breadcrumbs and titles. Not all of the content has been translated at this point, but we started the process. For the demonstration, what we're going to do is translate the newsroom section of the English website and update the equivalent content in German here as well. If you look at this content today in German, you'll notice that it is still in English, but it is showing some of the German content we've already translated in the preview. This is a pre-production view of the content. To translate the English content and update the German equivalent, you'll notice that we have a linking system called Smart Copy that identifies what translations exist for a given piece of content. So here you can see the newsroom page in the German website is inheriting its content from the English source content at the moment. We can go into the Translation Manager workbench, which in this case is connected to KJI Link, their translation management and project management tool. And we can create a new translation project. We could say German Newsroom Updates. That's going to be the name that will appear within KJI Link. We can indicate the language we want to translate our content into. In this case, that's going to be German. We have multiple different locales, so you can have multiple forms of German for different regions that you may want to be targeting. This is most common for things like Spanish, where there's many different regional dialects. You can also indicate the date to your project manager at KJI when you'd like that content to be complete. And then you can translate additional things beyond the web content, like your metadata and other items, if you are so inclined. Now, you have the option of finding content to translate in a couple of different ways. You can search for content here by the name or location, or by the date range. If you search by the date range, you would be returning all content that's been approved in some type of workflow process within a period of time. So you could pull all English content, for example, from the 1st of January to today's date and add all that content regardless of where it occurs within the English website. Now, in my case, I want to translate a specific section, so I'm going to search for that content by name. I'm going to add the newsroom section on here and include all of the child pages, so that's going to be all of these articles as well. You can do mass translation in this way. I'm going to choose the Add Items option, and it's going to show me the content that will be translated. There's quite a few different things here: newsletters, news articles, other content. When I've picked the specific items that I want to update, I'm just going to go in and submit that out to the KJI system. And it's going to take each one of those pieces of content and all of their associated assets and components or chunks of content, submitting those to the KJI system. We're doing that through a web services connection, so based on open standards that make it easy to integrate. And now we have a success message. At this point, we're going to see the project is going to leave the create area and show us that it is now open. You can see how many items we've submitted, when we've requested that to be complete. And from our side, you can see a number of different items like who submitted it, when it was submitted, and the individual content that you have sent to KJI. Now we can also go into their dashboard, and we'll just log in here with an account that I have handy. And in this case here, we'll just come in and just group up some content really quick. So we should be able to see there's our German newsroom update submission. This is the kind of dashboard of projects that have been submitted. Each one is associated with a variety of details. So if we go in and look at the details for a project here, you'll see who would be the project manager at KJI responsible for approving that, account manager when we'd like it done, what languages we'd like it translated to, how we're going to be connecting, what types of reviews we want, if we want an in-country manager, content manager to review it, translation certification, etc. And then choosing how we want to retrieve that content back. We can also specify additional instructions for different types of people along the way. Once we've kind of completed that process, it's going to go through the translation cycle using things like translation memory and other tool sets that KJI has. They're going to work with their language specialists, their reviewers. That process can take, depending on the amount of content, minutes, hours, days, depending on how many pages and items have to be updated. So once that's complete, we can jump back into our system. And at this point, we can check the status on our side. So we've already kind of pre-translated this just for the brevity of today's demonstration. So we're just going to go in here. We're going to check and see if our content's complete. And at this point, we should get a message back. And it's just going to take just a second because we've got quite a few different things. It looks like, let's just check one more time. Let's see. Should be ready. Law of demonstrations here. Let's see if it's done translating yet. It was quite a few files, so it might take just a little bit longer to complete that up. Maybe just for the sake of making sure we can show the whole process, I'm just going to go in and cancel that item for right now. We'll just make a smaller set of content. And we'll come in, just resubmit this. I'm only going to do one page just because the translation can take a little bit of time. We'll not include the child item, so we're only going to see that one item there. We'll submit that over to KJI again, and this page should be translated a lot faster. We'll just come in, and you can see now the project is all finished up and ready to go. So when we choose that process, we can say import. We get a nice little message here, a checkbox letting us know we're good to go, and we can choose finish. That's going to disappear from our open project list, and now we're going to see our small German test project. We can always review that and see the details on it if we need to. We can reopen that project if we wanted to have KJI's language specialists work on it again. Maybe we've done an internal review and decided we want to make changes, or we want to submit a newer update of this page to them. But now that that's been imported, we go look at the newsroom section here in the German website. what you're going to see is your content appearing in German, and you can see a few things like the breadcrumb and other details. A lot of the content on this page has been pulled in from the items underneath it, so these have not yet been translated, and that's why you're seeing the content appearing in English still at this point. So far we've just translated the title of the page basically, which is what's used in the navigations and footers. Let's just go in quick and we'll check on our other project and see if that larger set of content is all ready for us. So we should be able to, oh, actually, I guess I discarded that. But you can always translate it again. Let that finish. While that's happening, we'll just submit it one more time. We'll add all those items in. We'll let this do its thing because it's going to take just a few minutes longer. And while that's happening, I'll just touch a little bit on channelizing your content and structuring your content for multiple outputs. So as Andrea mentioned, you really need to think about how content will fit within different designs. In this example here, we're looking at some content we translated earlier today, and we can come in and view that content in multiple different outputs. So you can see at the moment we're viewing the desktop version of this page. If we were to look at it on a different form factor, you can see that we can quickly verify whether or not, in this case, German text will appropriately fit within the design of the system here. So we've got an appearance of different articles that are coming in. We can go to any one of these items and view that content as well, so the individual details, which are going to have a bit more content on them as well. We'll just jump down here and select one of these items. And then you can see that it also will have that mobile rendering as well with the details of the content, in this case mostly Latin text, so it isn't actually going to be translated too heavily. But if we were to look at the desktop view, you'd see maybe a bit more information kind of coming through about the content and really being able to deliver that translated content in multiple form factors.
Thanks for watching this recording of the webinar. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to contact either Andrea or Nathan at the addresses below. Thanks.